Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on achieving zero trust identity with the new 7 A's of IAM. Want to introduce myself. My name is Mark Callahan. I work here at Strata Identity. I'm one of the product marketers and the chief storyteller, if you will. And I'm joined this morning by Eric Olden, the CEO and co-founder of Strata. Hey, Eric, how's it going?
How's it going? Great. Thanks for having me, Mark.
Absolutely. Well, I love, you and I have worked together for many years in many different capacities. And, I know quite well your background as it comes to founding this company and others, but maybe some of the audience also doesn't know that you're one of the co-authors of SAML. And so as we talk about the A's of identity today, I just want the audience and the members of the CSA to sort of think about that, because what we're going to be talking about is kind of going back to the before times and also then talking about the today times. And Eric, you've helped me understand this in the past, as we think about the evolution of identity, and I just brought up a slide here, maybe walk me through and our audience through these phases as they've been built out.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And, I think the interesting thing is that the term identity management really didn't come in until the early 2000s. And before that, people just thought about security. And if you go before the commercial internet, when you had networks and people who were working remote and they were using VPNs to access their files, they used a protocol called Radius, and it was for remote access. And it was very common to have, hundreds or even a few thousand employees who would access your network. But we didn't really think about it as the way that we do today. We didn't call it identity management. And then the internet came out, and the web in particular moved from the notion of my employees are accessing things to now it's all of my customers and my employees and my partners, but they're coming into our website. And then the problem in the web access management era in the mid 90s, early 2000s
Mhm.
was all about how do we do security for the users, but we need to do it at scale. And that's really when people started to talk about identity management as a thing versus network security. And then as that took hold in the web became pervasive, then the next thing that started to happen was that people were using applications that ran on the web and things like software as a service, SaaS applications. And we needed to find a way to connect different identity systems. And that's really what drove the need for the first protocol for that, which was SAML. And SAML came out of necessity because it wasn't possible to do it all in one place. You had to collaborate and cooperate with other entities, but do that in a secure way. So SAML was designed to do that, and that opened the door to federation. And so now you could have identity that left your network and it's going to an application like that runs in the cloud today.
Mhm.
And that was really the federation era. And then I would say around 2010, then we started to see the rise of cloud computing and people starting to use more pure clouds. But the thing is, they didn't just use one cloud, they'd use the public cloud and they'd still have their private cloud. So it was multi-cloud. And so they had to think about identity in more than one location. And that became really the foundation for where we are today, which is the era of multi-cloud and as we see it, the era of fabrics, which are networks of identities. So it's been an
Absolutely.
interesting history for sure.
Well, so when you and I, began working together at first, I mean, we're over a decade ago, and you've been in the industry much longer than I have. Not trying to date you here, but nevertheless, you started teaching me about the A's of identity, and I think that our audience who is joining us today is also very familiar with the idea of these A's of identity. And I want to lead off by saying that as we talk about the 7 A's, hopefully that caught some folks' interest, and they're going, well, wait a minute, I thought there were only X number of A's, so to speak. And as we frame this in the era of zero trust architecture, I know it's kind of cliche, but we really are going A to Z. Maybe you can take us back through these three A's that started that radius era, the pre-internet, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the era before the web, you had services that were called AAA services, and the A's meant authentication. Who is the user? Are they who they represent themselves to be? How do we do access control, whether or not they can get to something? And then we need a way to report on all the activities that happen. So we need a way to audit. And so for many years, the AAA was something that you'd figure out, hey, we need to do that in our VPNs, we need to do that on our firewalls. But it was really a nice heuristic for people to keep it straight, right? Oh, I have three A's, and this is what they look like. It was pretty simple back then. It gets more complicated, but it started out pretty simple.
Let's jump ahead then. So these are probably some of the additional A's or A's of identity as our audience is familiar with. What changed and where did these others come in? So how did this come to be?
So identity built on the first three A's and extended it. So you saw authorization come into the conversation. And now we were trying to do things like fine-grained entitlements, and authorization meant, can you do something within an application? Can you open up a credit report? Can you open a marketing application, something where you're performing an action, where you want to have authorization enforced? Now, the way that you do authorization is using data, and the data that goes into an authorization decision are typically known as attributes. And because they're, in essence, the data keys that feed the authorization engine, you need to make sure that those attributes are securely sourced. So you don't let someone tell you that they're a vice president. You need to have that come from a certified or reliable source, maybe like an HR database. But the attributes were paired with the authorization so that you could do the fine-grained enforcement. And then the last one was, how do we manage all of this? And that governance is, another word for governance is administration. And so that's really where the sixth of these A's came in, because now we're trying to deal with all this at scale, and we needed a way to manage it. And that's where the administration component came in. And these six A's have served us really well all the way through. And it's like you build on one, builds on the next. So I don't think you're ever going to get away from authenticating, because
Sure.
zero trust, it's all about authenticate, right? Trust nothing, but always authenticate, always check access, always do the authorization, always record what happened. So this is really where I think that identity and zero trust have come together and are two sides of one coin.
So 2010s, let's call it, a thing happened and it changed a bit. And as we talk about that, those six A's still stand. But what you and I are talking about today is positing a seventh A, if you will. And that's one that we're calling availability. And that probably wasn't something that was even in people's minds or even technically possible prior to the multi-cloud era. Maybe explain where we came to be. Like, how was this possible now in the age of fabric, so to speak?
So if you think about the way that people rely on identity for their mission critical applications, it's not optional. So many people refer to it as a, excuse me, a tier 0 service like dial tone. If you don't have identity, you can't have your computing and everything else spin up. So it became a very mission critical part of computing. And the challenge up until multi-cloud was that you had no choice but to put all your eggs in one basket. And maybe that was, doesn't matter what vendor, it just was the architecture. You had everything going into a centralized identity system, and some were more reliable than others. But when that one thing ever had an outage, then it brought down everything else. And so with the rise of multi-cloud and the rise of multiple identity providers, Now you don't have that single point of failure. If you think about availability of your identity systems, now with multi-cloud, wouldn't it be a more effective way to do a failover if your primary identity provider had an outage, whether it's weather related, whether it's a cyber breach, whatever the case may be? Wouldn't it be really helpful to fail over from one identity system to another? And that's where high availability is really coming to the fore with identity, because now with multi-cloud, you can go from more than one, you have multiple, and that's
Yes.
really opened up a whole lot of new interesting use cases.
I love that. And it actually brings to light the idea of that fabric that you're talking about. The identity fabric is a very well-known construct that, Gartner and other analysts have talked about. It is one of that interoperability of all the services. And so as you're describing this idea of a failover, prior to the idea of having this fabric of sorts, it just wasn't an option because things were hard coded one to one. And now we're actually suggesting that there's a multitude of these things that you can actually seamlessly go from one to the other to create this availability and always on, if you will, scenario. Yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And it's borrowing a notion from things that we use at the network level to keep websites up and running, load balancers, right? So before load balancers, if your website got overwhelmed, it went down, and there's really nothing you could do about it except for disaster recovery, right? Rebuild it, get things back and running. And the whole time you've been down, you can't do things that you want to do. Then the networking market created these things called load balancers that would sit in front of your website and then be able to say, hey, if I'm going to round robin, I'll send some requests to the first one, I'll send some to the second one. A lot of different ways to configure it. But the point is there was a new thing in front of the other thing, right? The load balancer was in front of the website. So when you think about that from an identity standpoint, we need to have something that's the equivalent of the load balancer, but using the identity providers instead of the website. So that is a new type of proxy, right? And that's where we've seen the new role for a new type of software called Identity Orchestration, which orchestrates which identity provider is going to get used. And so that now is possible because it's not part of any one of the identity providers, but it sits in front of them so that you can now do something about it. If one of the identity systems goes down, you can point it, the orchestrator can point it at the one that's still up and running. So it's very common. A lot of our audience, I'm sure, are familiar with load balancers. Imagine now being able to load balance across identity systems, even if those systems are from different vendors and different technologies.
It's really cool that this is something that's actually feasible now. I know that for a period, you and I had talked with individuals where we talked about this idea of availability, and there was this idea of that just simply can't be done, but you have to frame it in the context of that identity fabric. And timely as our conversation is right now on this webinar, I know Gartner just put out a recent piece about the risks and how do you avoid a business outage that's related to a SaaS delivered IAM service. And I want to run a question by you that I think we've talked about a little bit and our audience will find interesting. So there's disaster recovery for identity service, and then there's the idea of continuity of identity services. Both play a role, but can you explain maybe the difference between that the continuity and the disaster recovery side of IAM?
Absolutely. And if you look at the parallels for data availability, right? People have been thinking about data backup for decades. And you have a way to back up your data in case your hard drive failed or you had a cyber breach. And with disaster recovery, it assumes you had a disaster that you're now trying to recover from. And the period the time it takes to get things back up and running are your recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives, right? So these are very
Sure.
well understood concepts in the data world. But now think about the a mission critical aspect of so many websites today, right? It could be how you board an airplane, how you order medicine in a hospital, how you do any number of different things, where if you have an outage, it's not only dollars that are at stake, you could have lives on the line. And so downtime is not an option. And so when you think about continuity, it's a way to always keep up and running. And so instead of recovering from a disaster, you avoid it in the first place. And you might think, well, why wouldn't we all just avoid a disaster?
Sure.
Well, we'd love to, but in order to do that, you need to have a way to see when something's about to happen and be able to do something in the event that something does happen. So they're not mutually exclusive either, right? You can have a disaster recovery plan, and everyone should, but you also want to have a continuity plan so that you can avoid the outage. And a good example or metaphor that I find is to compare disaster recovery with continuity. Imagine your disaster recovery is a car, and you have a car, it gets in an accident, but you have technology like seatbelts and airbags that minimize the time that you're going to be in the hospital if that's what were to happen.
But I'm still going to the hospital is what we're suggesting there. It's just I'm less hurt than I would have been otherwise.
That's right. And then you've got anti-lock brakes that are able to slow the car down so your vehicle doesn't get as destroyed. But in both cases, you're either got hurt or the car got wrecked, and now you're talking about how do we get back on the road, get back in on your feet so you're healthy and you're back doing what you want to do. Well, that's just the way things have always been. And now imagine a different way. Imagine an intelligent car that was able to see further than just the driver who's has their hands on the wheel, but it can sense that maybe a car is going to run a light at an intersection. And then the car automatically sees that, hey, there's an accident about to happen. I'm going to hit the brakes, let the car go through, and then I'll accelerate again. So for a few seconds of pause where the car, didn't get into an accident, but instead it detected a problem and avoided it. So which of those two would you rather be in, right? Would you want to be in the car that got into an accident or the car that avoided the accident? And I think that's a pretty simple answer, but that's the way to think about continuity. Continuity is avoiding the disaster. Disaster recovery is getting things back up and running.
That's great. And yeah, of course, I want to be back home for dinner, and that makes all the sense in the world as we think about this, and the timing of this idea of this new seventh A of availability. As we think about zero trust architecture and tying this back into the A's to the Z, so to speak, but we think about the availability aspect of things. There's scenarios where the reason for loss of availability is outside of your control, it's outside of your IAM vendor's control. I mean, there's natural disaster, there's things that could happen with a fiber cut, all sorts of things, but those disconnected states happen. And maybe if I could I ask you just to expand a little bit upon, industries or Fed Gov space, where this makes even more sense and even more need because it's a natural fit for disconnected networks.
Yeah. So it's October 2024. There's a huge hurricane that's happening as we are recording this. And this hurricane is happening a few weeks after one that was one of the biggest ones before. So hurricane season in North America is a kind of a predictable thing. We know when there's likely to be problems, but that doesn't mean that we need to suffer through them, right? And you think about the kind of things that happen with natural disasters, you lose power, you lose connectivity. And so imagine a situation where you are dealing with first responders or you're dealing with a disaster response where FEMA or one of the other agencies is going into what looks like a devastation zone. right? And I think we've seen the awful imagery of people's lives upended.
Hmm.
And in order to get things back and working, you need to be able to do things with technology nowadays. And so being able to run identity in a way that doesn't rely on all of the high bandwidth or the ability to reliably talk to the cloud is changing the way that we think about identity. So identity should be thought of as dial tone, but also dial tone that will work even when you don't have a connection to the broader network. And so that's where these disconnected use cases start to come together, which is, how do we have something that works really well when you can get access to the cloud, and it can work well even in the event that network connectivity is unavailable. And so these are, especially in the disaster recovery and the defense space, known as DDIL, or distributed, disconnected, intermittent, and low bandwidth kind of environments. And so
Hmm.
that's really creating a whole new subset of use cases where we're talking about the most mission critical, where lives are on the line, that are
Literally.
really thinking about availability in a real different way.
And I think a lot of the CSA members who are listening probably are familiar with those DDIL environments where things are so degraded or unpredictable that they don't know if they're going to have network connections or not. And so even though we're talking about this new A of availability in a multi-cloud era, there's still an on-prem element to this, or even in the case of a aircraft carrier, an on-ship element to this, because that place where you're going to be using authentication may actually be on-prem in a forward operating site or on board the ship itself, as opposed to a cloud connection when a DDL environment is you're encountered with it. Is that right?
That's exactly right, Mark.
That's fascinating. And so, as we look at this, it's hopefully our audience is now saying, wow, I knew that there are always all these A's for identity. And the idea of this seventh A of availability is one of almost just table stakes. They have to, hopefully as you're watching this and thinking, how much time can your organization afford to be offline? And if I may, Eric, I'm just going to take that car analogy maybe a step further. And I know we kind of joked about this over lunch one day, is the idea that if when you think about availability and you think about a hosted IAM platform, so your cloud IDP is sitting in front of all of those mission critical applications, well, it's almost akin to the car keys. The car can be functioning just fine, but if you don't have the car keys, the car's not going anywhere. It's just the same in these scenarios for organizations. All the applications can be just fine and operating as expected. The network availability is there, the internet is up, but if there's any hiccup with that cloud IDP, you've lost the car keys.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think there's some recent breaches that and outages that have really highlighted where it's so easy to lose the keys, right? It's not just with the giant hurricane. It can happen with human error. It could be bad software distribution, right? And over the summer of this year, there was a huge outage because of the software distribution system of one of the big
Hmm.
platforms. Worked as expected, but they had a mistake, but had a cascading effect. And what that I saw happen to a lot of large organizations is their leadership said, we don't want that to happen to us. How do we identify where we have a single point of failure? And doing an analysis where we understand, hey, this is where our most important applications are. And then these are all of the different systems that we rely on to deliver that, and making sure that every point along that chain is redundant and has the resiliency. I think a lot of people are really paying attention to it now because so many of these outages are having real day-to-day impact, and they're costing a lot of money, but there's people's lives that are being affected in a significant way as well.
Absolutely. And if I'm going to be cheeky and pretend that I don't know what our next slide is here, but nevertheless, you're talking about planning. And I think, as the audience is thinking about this, hopefully there's a bit of a, oh crap moment where they're realizing that they really do have these bottlenecks in their environments. And without this orchestrated fabric of multiple identity services that you can fail over to, they are at risk. And so, thinking about a plan, we always love in a webinar or a conversation to give folks something to think about and to act upon. Maybe you can walk us through some ideas around IDP downtime and how you can plan and prepare for it.
Yeah, that's happy to. And a friend of ours, he likes to say, hope is not a strategy. And so, Tom, if you're listening, you're right. Hope is not what you want to rely on to keep your business up and running. And instead, think about an outage is not a possibility. Think about it as an eventuality, as in it's not a question of whether it happens,
It's
it's a question
inevitable.
of, yeah, when is it going to happen? And
Yes.
when it happens, are you ready for it? And the time to, another expression I love is the time to dig a well is before you're thirsty, because when you're under duress, you're thinking differently and you're scrambling because you're like, oh shoot, we gotta fix this. So the advice that I would share with the audience is think about it. Come up with a plan. Number one, just take a stock of where your systems are, because not everything matters the same way, right? And you
Okay.
don't want to try and boil the ocean, but really do an inventory and figure out what it is that you have that you need to protect, and understand maybe like a tiering exercise, which is mission critical, what is business critical, what's important, and what's not important. And so now you've got a way to kind of organize your risk, is really what it comes down to.
That's true. And I think you just gave hopefully our audience a little bit of like relief here as they think about, oh my gosh, how do I keep parity with everything that I have running today and everything that's protected right now in a purely one-off backup state? It's not as difficult as that. They can actually start thinking about this and taking tranches of what they do need to have continuity and that always available identity for is maybe the suggestion if I said it differently.
That's right. That's a
Okay.
great way to say it. Think of triage as a way to focus on the highest priority and then work your way down the priority list. So that's the first step, is to get prepared. The second step is to, think about what is the plan and what are we going to do in the event that there is an outage. And, these are great opportunities to do what we call tabletop exercises, or on a
Mm-hmm.
whiteboard, just have a flow chart and say, if this happens, then these are the things we're going to do. And then everybody can get a shared understanding. The whole organization can say, yep, that's the plan. And we have a way to communicate it and practice it, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that goes to the third point, which is, hey, let's make sure that this plan is going to work. And I think when I leave my house, I'm going to the airport. If I'm going to get on a plane, I'm going to be away from my house for a while. I like to go back, and maybe it's like I'm obsessive about it, but I lock the door, go to my car, and I think, well, I got to double check. I go back out of my car and I shake my door and make sure that it really is locked.
Yes,
Like, you know how it can be if you, in the back of your mind, did I turn the iron off? And if
absolutely.
you don't know, then you're always wondering. And that's not I mean, it's one thing if you're talking about an iron, but you're talking about your business, right? You want to make sure that the plan that you have is going to work. And so thinking through and doing an exercise where you actually run the plan, that's going to be super important. So now you have a way to test it. Then step four, run it, right? This is where the plan is about, if this system goes down, this is what we're going to do. We're going to fail over to this one. And then we're going to focus on rebuilding the first one so it comes back as primary. And then we're going to fail it back from the secondary to the primary. So that's really just the way that continuity and any of these tools you should be looking for, right? They should run on autopilot. Like, it should not be manual effort to, fail over, you want something to detect it very quickly and do it
Hmm.
automatically. And so run the plan. And that usually involves seeing a problem, doing something about it, like failing over, fixing the problem that led to the failure. And then once that's fixed, then failing back. And then there's typically some kind of remediation where you need to do some record keeping to say, hey, this is what happened and this is what we did about it. And then the last thing is, what can you learn after that incident? And were there things that you can do better the next time? So the plans are not static, they should be dynamic. And so once you go through an outage, whether it's a test outage or an actual outage, you want to go back and look at the plan and say, hey, where did things work the way we thought they did? And maybe there were some areas of unanticipated consequences. And so you make improvements to that. So the next time something happens, you don't have the same kind of outcome necessarily. So really thinking about it in 5 steps, it's about being prepared, planning, test it, run it, and make it better.
Love it. Well, hopefully we just gave the audience something to do and to think about. And in saying that, would love to offer the audience something additional to think about. I know that it takes a lot of effort to create. People are often familiar with these dummies books, and something you and I both learned together is that creating one is not knowing a little bit about a topic and having just enough to create a dummies book. It's the other direction. It's having to know everything about something and boil it down to the salient points to make it approachable. And these new A's of identity, and as we think about identity zero trust posture, hopefully, this is a great read that you've created. You've literally written the book on identity orchestration and those A's. And I'd like to invite the audience to go ahead, and you can use this link here to get access to the book. Let us know what you think, because it's really going to help frame all the things I believe that you and I just talked about on this conversation with some additional use cases, and makes it a little bit some newish illustrations as well. So hopefully this is a great resource and textbook for people wanting to learn more about the new A's of identity, if you will. So, well, Eric, I thank you so much for joining me. I get to talk to you every day, but it's always a pleasure. It really is. And hopefully our audience appreciated the time together today.
Well, I had a great time, Mark. Thanks for having me, and would encourage anyone who's interested in this book. Is not a marketing book. It is more a how-to guide. So I think some of the feedback has been, oh, this is great. It's not selling something, but it's really trying to educate and say, these are things to think about and ways to approach it. So hopefully you and the audience enjoy the book and get some good education from it at the same time.
Love it. Well, they can find the book at strata.io/dummies-book. We also want to thank the CSA for giving us the opportunity to talk to you all, our audience. Thank you for spending your time with us in this webinar. And I hope you found it really interesting. Again, Eric, thanks for the conversation. Audience, think about these new ways of identity and go out there and think about availability. As you look at your own organization, where does availability fit into the mix for you? So without any more, I'd love to say thanks. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye for now.